The Strait of Hormuz did not close last year. It did not close the year before that either. And if you look at how the region has been behaving, the drone strikes, the seized tankers, the missiles fired in the dark, that fact alone should raise a question that almost nobody is asking out loud. Why not? Iran has been backed into a corner economically, humiliated diplomatically, and sanctioned into near poverty by the West. Its proxies are fighting wars on multiple fronts. Its leaders regularly threaten to shut down the most important waterway on the planet. And yet the oil keeps flowing. Every single day, 20 million barrels pass through that 21-mile gap without interruption. Something is holding Iran back, and it is not the American aircraft carriers sitting just over the horizon. Understanding what that something actually is will change the way you read every headline coming out of the Middle East for the rest of your life. This analysis exists for one specific purpose: to cut through the noise and illuminate the structural forces shaping our world before they become obvious to everyone else. Today we are going to dismantle the conventional story about the Strait of Hormuz. The story that puts American naval power at the center of the whole equation will be replaced with the actual story, which is quieter, stranger, and far more consequential for the future of global power. Before we go any further, it is important to be clear about the nature of this examination. Everything we are discussing is grounded in data from the United States Energy Information Administration, the International Energy Agency, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and reporting from major financial and newswire services. The Middle East is a region where situations evolve rapidly, and this is not an attempt to predict specific events. The goal here is to hand you a framework, a lens that will help you make sense of what you are watching unfold in real time. So let's start with the geography, because geography is the one thing that never lies. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran on one side and Oman and the United Arab Emirates on the other. At its narrowest point, it is about 21 miles wide. Through those 21 miles flows roughly 20% of the entire world's daily petroleum consumption. That number is almost impossible to absorb. 1 in every 5 barrels of oil consumed on Earth today passes through a channel barely wider than some major cities are long. When analysts call it the world's most important energy choke point, they are not being dramatic. They are simply reading a map. For decades, the dominant theory was simple. The only thing keeping Iran from using that geography as a weapon was the United States Navy, specifically the Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain, with its carrier strike groups, its minesweepers, its intelligence apparatus, and its implicit threat of overwhelming military retaliation. This was the framework that governed the whole region from the Carter Doctrine of 1980 onward. A sitting American president stood before Congress and declared that any attempt by an outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf would be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. For 40 years, that declaration was the load-bearing wall of Middle Eastern security architecture. But here is what changed, and it changed so gradually that most people did not notice it happening. The primary customer for the oil flowing through that strait shifted. It used to be the West. The United States, Europe, and Japan consumed the vast majority of Persian Gulf crude, and therefore had a direct, visceral national interest in keeping the route open. That was the world of the 1970s and 80s, the world the Carter Doctrine was designed for. But the shale revolution transformed American energy. By the early 2020s, the United States had become a net exporter of crude oil. Its dependence on Persian Gulf supply had dropped dramatically. Europe was diversifying. Japan was adjusting. And meanwhile, on the other side of the equation, China had become the single largest importer of crude oil on the planet, and an enormous percentage of that oil was coming from the Middle East, traveling directly through the Strait of Hormuz. Pause on that for a moment because the implications are enormous. The country with the greatest strategic need to keep the strait open is no longer the United States. It is China, and China is not just a passive consumer sitting on the sidelines. China is Iran's most important economic partner. According to energy analytics firms and global trade reporting, China purchases the overwhelming majority of Iranian oil exports, doing so in deliberate defiance of Western sanctions. Without that revenue, the Iranian government's finances would collapse. China is not simply Iran's best customer. It is, at this point, Iran's economic oxygen supply. This is the architecture of the quiet veto. Think about what it means in practice. If Iran were to mine the Strait of Hormuz, or use its coastal missile batteries to shut down tanker traffic, it would not primarily be hurting the United States. The United States has its own oil. What Iran would actually be doing is cutting off the energy supply of the one country propping up its entire economy. It would be, in the most literal financial sense, an act of self-destruction. Beijing does not need to issue public ultimatums. It does not need to send warships or make speeches at the United Nations. The message is delivered through the invisible language of trade dependency. Cross this line and you are on your own. And for the Iranian government, being on its own is not a diplomatic inconvenience. It is an existential threat. The moment that crystallized this new reality for many analysts was March of 2023, when China brokered a normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, two countries that had not had diplomatic relations for years, two powers whose rivalry had been fueling proxy conflicts across the region, sat down and shook hands because Beijing asked them to. Major financial publications and research institutions covered this extensively, and the interpretation was broadly the same. China was not doing this out of idealism. It was protecting its investments, its energy pipelines, and its Belt and Road Initiative. Beijing had looked at the map, calculated the cost of regional instability, and decided to spend political capital to buy stability. The Saudi-Iran deal was, in essence, China telling the entire Persian Gulf that it was now the region's primary patron, and that it expected the region to behave accordingly. To understand how significant this shift is, you have to go back to the tanker war of the 1980s. During the Iran-Iraq conflict, both sides began targeting commercial shipping in the Gulf in an attempt to strangle the other's oil revenue. Tankers were hit with missiles and mines. Insurance rates skyrocketed. The global oil market went into a state of prolonged anxiety. The United States eventually intervened directly, launching a major naval engagement in 1988, in which American forces directly struck Iranian ships and oil platforms. It was a decisive demonstration of American willingness and ability to enforce the freedom of navigation through hard military power. The world watched and concluded that Washington was the enforcer of last resort in the Persian Gulf. And that conclusion held for the next 35 years. What we are witnessing right now is the replacement of that enforcer model with something fundamentally different. Military deterrence enforced by an outside power is being quietly supplemented, and in some ways supplanted, by economic deterrence enforced by commercial dependency. China has not built a carrier strike group to patrol the Gulf. It has built something more effective, a web of trade relationships so dense and so financially critical to every major player in the region that destabilization becomes an act of economic self-harm. This is what some analysts have started calling commercial security. The protection is real. The enforcers are just accountants and energy traders rather than admirals. The contrast between the Strait of Hormuz and what is happening in the Red Sea right now makes this point with remarkable clarity. Since late 2023, rebel forces in Yemen have been launching sustained attacks on commercial shipping passing through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, citing the war in Gaza as justification. The United States and its allies stood up a multinational naval partnership to defend the route. Naval vessels from multiple Western nations are actively patrolling the area, shooting down drones, intercepting missiles, and escorting tankers. It is expensive, dangerous, and diplomatically complicated work. Meanwhile, reports from regional media outlets have noted something extraordinary. Chinese-flagged vessels, and in some cases ships that have broadcast their Chinese affiliation on their tracking systems, have largely been left alone by the attackers. China has publicly called for the attacks to stop, but it has conspicuously declined to join the Western naval coalition defending the route. Beijing is allowing the United States to absorb the military and financial cost of securing the Red Sea, while relying on its unique relationship with Tehran to keep the infinitely more important Strait of Hormuz undisturbed. This is not an accident, it is strategy. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank have both modeled what a genuine Strait of Hormuz closure would look like for the global economy, and the numbers are staggering. Oil prices could spike to $150 or even $200 per barrel in the most severe scenarios. Global shipping costs would skyrocket. Inflation would surge across every country dependent on maritime trade. And the country that would feel this most severely, more than the United States, more than Europe, would be China. Its manufacturing sector, the engine of its economic and political stability, is almost entirely dependent on those maritime energy routes. There is no strategic reserve large enough, no domestic production sufficient to compensate for a prolonged closure. China's vulnerability is paradoxically the source of its leverage. Because it has so much to lose, Everyone in the region knows that Beijing will do whatever it takes to prevent a closure. And because Iran knows that China will do whatever it takes, and because Iran needs China to survive, the strait stays open. There is another dimension to this story that tends to get buried under the geopolitical analysis, and it may ultimately be the most consequential of all. For decades, the oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz has been priced and settled in United States dollars. This is not a trivial detail. It means that every transaction, every barrel bought and sold, passes through the dollar-dominated global financial system. It gives Washington a form of financial visibility and leverage over the entire global energy market that it maintains even in regions where its military and diplomatic influence is fading. But as China's economic footprint in the Gulf has expanded, so has the use of the Chinese yuan in energy settlements. Financial news outlets have reported discussions between Gulf producers and various Asian partners about pricing some crude sales in yuan. Iran, already locked out of the dollar system by sanctions, has been settling trades with China in alternative currencies for years. If the Strait of Hormuz gradually becomes a waterway where trade is settled in yuan and secured by Chinese diplomatic relationships, the petrodollar system faces its most serious structural challenge since the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement. This is not just an energy story. It is a story about the architecture of global finance, and about whether the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency will survive the geopolitical transition we are currently living through. Now consider the domestic context constraining each player, because none of these governments operate in a vacuum. The United States is navigating a deeply polarized political environment in which public appetite for overseas military commitment is at a generational low. The memory of long-ground wars in the Middle East has not faded. Any administration proposing a major military intervention in the Persian Gulf would face enormous political resistance at home, and every government in the region knows this. Iran is facing severe internal economic pressures. Inflation has eroded living standards dramatically. The population's patience with the political system is not unlimited. China is managing a cooling property market, rising youth unemployment, and the long-term pressures of demographic decline. In this environment, every major power is incentivized toward managed tension rather than genuine explosion. The threat of the strait is useful politically for all of them. The reality of a closure is catastrophic for all of them. So, the tension is carefully maintained just below the threshold where it would become uncontrollable. This dynamic also helps explain something that often confuses casual observers: why Iran keeps taking provocative actions, seizing tankers, funding proxy attacks, enriching uranium, without ever actually triggering the catastrophic escalation that its rhetoric seems to invite. Because Iran is not at its core trying to close the strait. It is trying to use the fear of closure as a bargaining chip. Every missile test, every seized vessel, every threatening statement is a performance designed to remind its adversaries of what it could do, while China's quiet presence in the background ensures that it never actually does it. The result is a region that generates enormous geopolitical noise, but beneath the surface, extraordinary structural stability. The volatility is mostly theatrical. The expansion of the BRICS grouping adds another layer of institutional weight to this new architecture. With Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates all invited to join the expanded bloc, the Persian Gulf is being drawn into a Chinese-centric economic and diplomatic framework at an accelerating pace. Trade volumes between China and the Gulf Cooperation Council have now surpassed those between the Gulf and either the United States or the European Union. When trade reaches that scale, security becomes a shared commercial interest rather than an externally imposed military obligation. The Gulf states are not abandoning their relationships with Washington. They are diversifying them, and in that diversification Beijing has found its leverage. So what does all of this mean looking forward? The short answer is that we are in a transition, and transitions are inherently unstable periods. The old rules, the Carter Doctrine, the primacy of the Fifth Fleet, the automatic equation of American military presence with regional stability are losing their explanatory power. But the new rules are not yet fully codified. China has the commercial influence to deter, but it does not yet have the military infrastructure to enforce. The United States has the military capability, but the political will to use it in the Gulf is eroding. This gap between commercial deterrence and hard security is the most dangerous space in the current architecture, because if a crisis were to escalate faster than Beijing's diplomatic channels could contain it, There is genuine uncertainty about who steps in and how. Watch for two indicators in particular. First, any signs that the Saudi-Iran normalization brokered by Beijing is beginning to fray. If that agreement collapses, the regional buffer China has built disappears with it, and the threat calculation changes dramatically. Second, watch the trajectory of Chinese naval activity in and around the Gulf. Their base in Djibouti, their anti-piracy operations near Somalia, their expanding maritime capabilities, these are not isolated developments. They are the early infrastructure of a power that is slowly, deliberately preparing for the possibility that it may one day need to protect its energy supply, not just through diplomacy, but through presence. The final point to leave you with is this. The most important forces shaping our world are almost never the ones generating the loudest headlines. The Strait of Hormuz stays open not because of press conferences or carrier deployments. It stays open because of an invisible web of financial dependency, commercial interest, and economic consequence that has been quietly constructed over 2 decades of Chinese investment, energy trade, and regional diplomacy. The hand on the throat has changed. The threat is still real, but the nature of the deterrent has been transformed from military to commercial, from public to private, from American to Chinese. That transformation is one of the defining geopolitical stories of our era, and almost nobody is talking about it. The Strait of Hormuz will remain the single most important energy choke point on Earth for the foreseeable future, but the rules governing it have already changed. Understanding the change is not just an academic exercise. It shapes everything from the price of fuel to the value of investments, to the foreign policy decisions being made in capitals around the world right now. The quiet stories are always the ones that matter most.